Recording. So, just a very brief introduction to what the context of this session is. And this kind of comes from conversations between myself and George and Ivana and others. Responding to climate change isn't a straightforward thing. For the average UK home to get anywhere near what we're talking about as being zero carbon requires work to both the fabric of the house or the heating supply systems, and also to the fabric and also to the heating systems themselves within the house. By its nature, it's likely to be disruptive. And for most of us, the main thing we want to do at our homes is to live there, not rip bits of it apart and fill it with dust and builders. Obviously, some of us are exceptions to that. So, for those who are homeowners or about to become one, the point at which we start looking for our new home has a special significance. Given that vanishingly few homes are actually ready for the zero carbon future, what should you be looking for as the estate agent beguilingly leads you into the house and shows you around and tells you how wonderful it all is? If you want a future home, what do you buy and what do you do to it? What we're going to do this evening is look at the experience of two households where they've used moving home as an opportunity to make drastic changes to the house that they bought. We will hear from a local organisation that can help you with this process. And we'll also hear a bit about how the council can provide funding. And that's where we're going to start, with me handing over to Alison Webb.
Okay, hello everybody. So my name is Alison Webb and I'm actually from the council, so I'm from the Housing Standards and Adaptations team, and a very small team within that service called the Home Energy team, or that's what we now call ourselves. I'm going to just show you a couple of slides to show you what we're actually offering, what is available at the moment through our service. Do you want to give me a nod or a thumbs up if you, that's lovely. Okay, so the home upgrade grant, that's what we're offering at the moment. So I'll tell you a little bit about what the home upgrade grant is. How do I go on to my next slide? He says,
up or down arrow on your keyboard?
Ah, there it is. It's the side arrow, yes. Becomes obvious. So yeah, so as I said, I'm from the Home Energy team. We're a team of, I think, 3.2 people at the moment, but sadly we're going to be getting less before we get bigger, fewer people. So we try and deliver all the energy efficiency kind of grants and initiatives, really covering York, but we don't only cover York, we cover Craven District Council, Harrogate and Selby. So we cover 4 different councils as well. So we're trying to, deliver energy efficiency measures in those 4 areas. So the people who we support really are people on low incomes living in energy efficient homes. Hey, I hear you say, because that's actually why you're here, to talk about energy efficiency, and definitely after I've told you about the grant, that it's the basics and it's only a start. There's much more than than the grant we've got on offer. So the grant is actually known to us as Home Upgrade Grant. So give your house a hug is what we normally say to people, trying to promote the measures. It's an insulation grant for the domestic properties. So when I say installation, it's basic insulation, basic measures that have been happening for quite a long time that I'm sure everybody knows of, and even how they're actually undertaken, how the measures are installed. So it's basically cavity wall insulation and loft insulation. We will also do some draft proofing for if we're not installing or replacing windows. We will draft proof existing windows as part of a secondary measure, as part of having one of the other measures as well. And the thing that we're also doing at the moment is attic room and roof insulation. The criteria for a room to be classed as a room in a roof and not a loft is having a fixed staircase and a window. So the attic loft room can have either a dormer or a Velux style window. It doesn't have to have a dormer, but you do have to have a fixed staircase as well. Otherwise, that is classed as a loft and not an attic room. But we are insulating both. So under the Home Upgrade grant, it's the first time we've actually done attic room in a roof installation as an authority. So you know, we hopefully we'll get enough applicants for that to be successful. There's quite a lot of properties in York as well that do have attic rooms. Mine included. This room, I mean, you can still see the bare plaster on the wall, not yet been decorated, but it's only been a year like this. So, but fully insulated, yeah. And the maximum grant that we're offering is 10,000 or 5,000, depending on tenure. So basically what that means is we're looking at installing insulation into private sector, not currently in social housing. But if it's a private rented property, then we do ask for a landlord contribution. So that is when the grant maximum is £5,000 for landlords for private rented properties. So it's a landlord contribution, not a householder contribution for those properties as well. And landlords will have to pay a third of the actual total costs. So they won't necessarily get the maximum £5,000 grant. It literally does depend on the cost, the total cost of the grant. If it's an attic room in a roof room, it is likely to, you know, obviously costs more than that. So they might achieve the maximum grant there as well. Hope that makes sense and not convoluted explanation. So there is eligibility criteria because the funding is government funding. We've received it from BEIS, and we do have to always attach some criteria to any public money that we offer. So the criteria is twofold: household income of up to £30,000 a year, and energy rating of D to G. And £30,000 a year is not, if there's two people living in a property, it's not a high amount, but it is actually a move in the right direction, because historically people have had to earn up to 21,000 or even less, 16.5, to apply for grants. So we are moving in the right direction, so to speak. And then an EPC energy rating of D to G. Having said that, we come across quite a lot of properties that are D-rated, and we're not able, under the funding, to install all D-rated properties. We're not able to install more than 50% of D-rated. And obviously, if you're just buying a property, moving home, then there will be an EPC on a property, but not all properties have an EPC. But that is something that we can arrange. So as part of the grant funding, we will ask some questions about the property if there's no EPC, and then we can arrange for an EPC done as part of the grant funding as well. We do find that if it's an elderly occupant, or for example, that they might have lived in a property for quite some time and there is no EPC, but that is not, you know, people can still apply or be referred for the grant even if there isn't an EPC. And then finally, there's our contact details on how to apply, or how to refer people, or how to ask questions. That's our email address. So that comes literally to the energy team, to myself and a couple of others. And then that's our telephone number. That's our telephone number for the whole of the housing standards team, but anyone, you know, can answer the call there and refer it on. So, and any questions, I think, at this stage?
There's a question in the chat box from Jamie, who's asked, presumably the income threshold is 30k gross, i.e. before tax.
Gross, yes, it is. Yes. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions?
Okay.
No. Alison's off for a tea. Brilliant.
Yes, yeah. Long awaited evening meal. So yeah. But please do get in touch if in doubt.
That's great. Thank you. And I'll circulate your details with email out to everybody afterwards. So who wants to get your contact details.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Alison. So what we'll do now is to move on to one of these two or major undertakings, and we'll speak here first from George about George and Julia's house on Scarcroft Hill. So George, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks a lot, Phil. Can I just check that everyone can hear me? Great. Yeah, so I'll go through what we did in our home, and then some of the considerations, that if you're looking to buy a house, um, that would be useful, and things that I would have liked to have known perhaps before starting the whole process. We did quite a lot before. There's a lot of prep work, so it wasn't like total disaster, but there are definitely things that I would have done differently, having gone through it once. So the first thing is, when you get the brochure from the estate agent and go around it, it's going to be a really nice house, potentially, have a good finish, potentially, and that's a really tough decision. Like, this was a done house. Uh, it was just a very inefficient house, but it had a veneer finish that was lovely, and so it was Phil knew. So Phil was my effective energy architect, in the process, and he knew that I was massively into sort of eco retrofit, and that was our big thing. And despite knowing this, the thing he said to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Because it was, a really lovely house. And the answer was yes, we absolutely want to do it, because at that point we were not so attached to the house that it was, a big thing. We wanted to make our stamp on the house anyway, and so we would have been doing some things differently, but this was our opportunity to effectively kind of do a deep retrofit. But as you can see, some nice rooms, bathrooms all finished, all to a good standard. So the first steps, I'd say, was just getting, before we'd even purchased the house, was just make sure you ask for the energy bills. They can anonymize it or however, what they want to do, but the main thing is how many kilowatt hours. Ideally, if they've got the monthly bills, that's the best. So at least you get a sort of sense of seasonal consumption. And then gas and electricity. And so what we got from that was sort of 2 years of data, and we could see on average they were spending about £1,600 a year on energy, split across gas and electricity. So that's already good base, if you like, because when we start doing some heat loss calculations on the as is, it's good to sort of cross check and how does that correspond to what they were actually paying. Once purchased, I suppose you could actually do the air tightness test as a kind of request, if you like. It's not invasive in any way. You'll see a picture on the right hand side of the screen. Effectively, they tape up the front door, put a big fan on it, and this one was getting a negative pressure difference, so they 50 pascals, and then you can really see Phil was inside running around, so taking images, and seeing where all the terrible gaps were, and why the house was leaky. Whether you do that before or after purchase, I don't think it really matters. It's going to be leaky almost certainly if it's a sort of Victorian terrace. The question is how leaky, and air tightness adjustments are actually quite simple, and very inexpensive as far as I'm concerned. You can do it yourself. I don't think you need to pay anyone to do it personally, but maybe Ivana will have different views. But I think it's tape and mastic, and we can all do that. But it's good to know where the issues are. I think it's absolutely essential to get an energy engineer or energy architect involved as early as possible. If you don't, then you're not going to have options appraisals and so on, and think like, well, what intervention should I be doing? And you might go to the sort of wrong interventions potentially. And so I think Ivana later will talk about what's Nick's offer. There are lots of people out there. Phil's one of them. There are others still, and it's just sort of get someone involved, because what you don't want is just sort of the gas engineer to come in and look at the gas boiler, tell you it's a 28 kilowatt boiler, and we'll just replace that then. That's not going to get us to sort of the level that we need. It needs to be a whole system design if you're going to go for a deep energy retrofit. And just be prepared. Your world is going to turn upside down. For me, it was possibly the most stressful 9 months. I've got 2 kids, and all of that just pales in comparison. The level of stress was very high, And so part of what I would do differently is I would think again about, could I get someone to sort of project manage on my behalf and pay for that? Taking that on board was, I hadn't anticipated just how stressed that was. So getting someone as a project manager might be something worth paying for. In terms of that first step, so what we did with Phil effectively was we worked through a series of options, worked through Passive House software to sort of make our decisions around, do we want to do internal wall installation or external wall? If we're going to do external wall, what are the issues with planning? So we made an early planning permission. I can't remember what you call it, Phil, but there was like a initial request. And so we could get that answered quite quickly. Yeah, and so we made that application, and it was very clear very quickly that it was a no-go with external wall. So fine, we're going to do internal wall. Or which walls should we do? All, you know, and so we sort of looked at, well, what if we just do? We're an end of terrace property. Maybe we should just do the end wall and forget sort of all the bitty bits around windows. What does that do? Should we do floor insulation between joists? Should we be focusing on air tightness? Should we be focusing on glazing, etc., etc.? And sort of you get the sort of outputs from the Passive House modeling, and it gave us sort of a sense, if you like, of what we needed to do. And then we could start budgeting and thinking, how does that marry up to what we want? Also allowed us to think a bit around what heating system we wanted. The software is really good and it's very intuitive, and someone, you know, like Phil or others can effectively, if you're not too comfortable with some of the values that it's sort of talking about, it still gives graphical outputs like this and can be quite easily summarized, so that you can have a sort of meeting to discuss options. And we did that, and we actually had a meeting with me, my partner Phil, and our proposed energy engineers to actually talk about the options, and then that fed into our energy engineers' heat loss calculations. So I thought it worked quite well, actually, that early stage discussions. I then got my crowbar out and started ripping stuff up, and so I sort of took out the floor. I used a Leeds wood recycling company to recycle all the timber. They're really cool, actually. Costs basically the same as a skip, but they will recycle all of the timber, and what they can use, they'll use, and what they can't, effectively, that it will go to biomass incineration, or chipboard, I think they said. So yeah, and they're a local community investment company, really lovely people. So I did about 3 trips, I think, with them. We had a lot of timber. So anyway, I started to excavate, and then that's when the problems start to be uncovered. So discovered that actually, it was quite comical, actually. The underfloor vents that were meant to be under the floor were actually not under the floor at all. So they were, a surprise, there was massive water ingress around this point. I don't know if you can see my cursor. And as a result, all of the joists were completely rotten. But in a way I thought, well, that is a shame, but at least I've identified it. I can plan for it now, and started getting quotes from builders to sort of have the joists replaced. But, you know, that was an unexpected cost. And we also put a telescopic ventilation system. That sounds fancier than it really is. It's just a piece of plastic that takes the air beneath the floor, as opposed to just simply at floor level. In the defense, I think what happened is that the outside was raised at some point, and they did a botched job, or something along those lines, just quickly. So I doubt the Victorians would have made that mistake. Anyway, so initial demolition to sort of start to figure stuff out. We then got the builders in to do the heavy demolition, and there was a big decision: do we or don't we take out the chimney stacks? And in the end, decided yes, we should, because we're going to do internal insulation, which means that we're going to lose space. We're going to lose at least 100 mil, because that's the depth of the insulation. Plus, you're going to have skims of plaster, so you're going to probably be at around maybe 120 mil by the time you're finished. But if we take the chimneys out, suddenly the rooms become squarer, allowing us to be a bit freer in the room, and we've freed up all that space And so it doesn't feel like actually we've lost anything. If anything, we've gained space. So that was quite attractive. Plus, we've now removed one of the key heat losses, which is the chimney itself, just all of your air going out of the chimney. If we'd retained it, we still would have had to have ventilated it, and so you'd be losing air, heat through the chimney. So all in all, it felt like a good decision. And so the steel plus replacement demolition costs about just under £5,000. So it was quite an investment, but I thought well worth it actually, given the space we were saving. So yeah, that was a big decision. We then got all the walls taken back to all the external walls taken back to masonry, and this is so that we can then start building up the insulation. And we were going to settle on a wood fiber insulation. So that's using a lime render, then wood insulation, and then a final lime skin. And this kind of system is designed really to allow vapor to move through the fabric. And that's quite good for a Victorian building, which really was designed to do exactly that, just across the masonry. They used a lime mortar and vapor would move quite freely across. Unfortunately, many of the properties in York, and I think more widely, have been repointed with cement. The cement is harder than the bricks, and that's why a lot of us have, these lovely red brick facades, but many of the bricks have lost their faces. It's because the water gets trapped, it can't get out, it freezes and blast, it all comes out. If it had lime mortar, then it would be able to escape via the mortar. So anyway, we did repoint at some point at points outside, but I couldn't afford the whole house, unfortunately, but maybe one day. So anyway, lots of demolition. Then got a fantastic local contractor called Craig Young, who is, he does a lot of external wall rendering, but importantly, he's got a rendering machine. And so we talked to the supplier and confirmed that we could use his rendering machine with lime plaster. And that meant that Craig was able to offer a really competitive price for what this is. So there's a kind of Which report that suggests that if you were to do plastic insulation between kind of stud work, you're looking at about £10,000 to £12,000 on average for a property of this size. With Craig, we were able to do, essentially it is, a natural fiber, wood fiber system. So labor plus materials came in at about £25,000. So it's definitely, obviously it's more expensive, but it's far more labor intensive. Craig could have a team of 4 guys rendering. If you think most people want to do dot and dab plastering, this is rendering onto a wall, which is uneven, Victorian. Got to get it pretty straight. You can see him with this. This is when he's just done the first coat before insulation. They've got to get it all pretty straight so that you're not going to get air pockets behind. And then insulate once that's been done, and then do another skim as well. So when I got it quoted from a guy in Sheffield who's a real expert in this area, he wanted a team to do it by hand. It was 3 times the price, and that suddenly you think, not even beginning to even contemplate that as a reality. So the use of a rendering machine, an external rendering machine, to do the internal work really made this economic. I mean, it's still expensive, really expensive, like double the price of plastic, but it's a natural fiber, and that's what we wanted. So think of it a bit like I wanted a posh kitchen, and rather than a not posh kitchen. That was a sort of life choice, but it has enhanced the fabric, and it fits better, I would say, with the Victorian sort of design. You can see here the insulation having arrived. I think many of our neighbours thought we had misordered. There was so much. I had a few comments. And I'd also at one point thought perhaps I had been sorted, but I hadn't. I was about 4 or 5 panels out, which you're always going to get some excess, and I was able to free cycle those. And I think a local guy actually insulated a birdhouse. I think he said he was doing so. A dovecot, I think it was. Anyway, good, lucky doves. So anyway, that was the beginning of the insulation. And here we can start to see as it comes on the wall, it's a tongue and groove system, and they use plastic pins effectively to adhere. There's an adhesive that goes behind the insulation, and then you use plastic pins effectively to hammer it in and hold it in place, and it's tongue and groove. For the kitchen, we used cork. This was that's 100 ml cork. I didn't actually want to do that, but had to do it, unfortunately, because our supplier insisted on it, because they were concerned about damp moving up into the walls. Cork is much better than wood fibre at dealing with more severe damp, were that to happen. But having done the cork, this would be a lesson learned for me, is actually it was very easy to cut. It was very so you could do a mitered cut or a straight cut with a standard circular saw very easily, whereas the wood fiber, I mean, it's your blade starts to move. Even with a table saw, it's actually quite difficult to cut a straight line at 100 mil. I reckon if you're at sort of 50 to 80 mil, you'd probably be okay with a jigsaw using a special insulation blade. But once you got to 100 mil, it was, you know, the blade would slightly move, and it was very difficult, and I think added a lot of time actually to doing the work. So if I was doing it again, the cost of cork is about the same as wood fiber. It comes in kind of neater packets. It's got good thermal resistance, slightly better actually than wood fiber. And actually, initially I was concerned that, you know, hey, wait a second, this is cork, isn't that, you know, pretty valuable stuff? And it's kind of coming from Portugal. What's the sustainability credentials of those? But actually, I looked into it more and spoke to the supplier. And these are from Portuguese trees, where they're effectively taking the bark off the tree and then allowing it to grow back over, I think, a 20-year period. And with the demise of sort of cork bottle corks, they're actually looking for alternative uses for this kind of cork bark. And so actually, no trees are killed. You're just taking the bark off. I mean, it's relatively sustainable. I presume there's not going to be enough for everyone in the world to do cork, because there are only so many cork trees, I assume. So I'd imagine wood fiber, from a sustainability perspective and mass delivery, is going to be the one. But as an individual choice level, cork's definitely got advantages. I also took all of the insulation that was used in the kitchen floor and then actually re-insulated the loft. And sort of got kind of much better tape, so it's a bit more airtight. Previously, it had just been the most token amount of rock wool you could imagine. I can't imagine how cold that spare bedroom would have been. But now it's got 100 mil POR insulation. I'm not a huge fan of plastic insulation, but it was there, might as well use it, so I did. Another thing to note, and I know that Craig and everyone thought I was absolutely bonkers, but anyway, I was insistent that we took the insulation through the ceiling and up through so the joists, so that you're not trying to minimize the amount of thermal bridging between floors. I think in hindsight, I would have just probably come down rather than come up and through, because we actually ended up replacing the floors upstairs. So realistically, I could have just left the ceiling and then come down and just left a very small amount of plaster touching the external wall. So I might have done that differently. It would have saved me a lot of ceiling fixing later, but I learned a lot doing that. So, you know, every cloud has a silver lining. But definitely looking to insulate through. I think that is important, and there's quite a good study from Leeds City Council on insulating Victorian homes. I'll try and dig that out, or Phil, I don't know, we read it at the very beginning of the project. I don't know if that's something we can dig out and put in the chat, but I found that really useful as a document, as it's like a really handy guidebook. So once the floor joists were in, I then effectively put a vapor membrane, a vapor barrier underneath. I then put an airtight barrier on top. And put battens in to then allow insulation in between. I had spaced the joists from the recommendation of the guy actually who came from Sheffield. It was the best call out actually. So even though it was too expensive, I paid for the call out. And one piece of advice he said is make sure that the joist spacing fits the insulation, because the wood fiber insulation that you can see here, again, it's really difficult to cut in a straight line. Whereas I had them spaced exactly right and then slot it in. And now I look like a pro, even though if I'd got it even slightly less, it would have been very difficult to cut it professionally to make it look good and actually snug so that you're not getting any gaps. So that was a good tip actually I got. So oddly, the Pavatex floor insulation only comes in 2 widths. So I can't remember what exactly they are. It's something like 375 mil, but just look that up. And then if you're re-spacing, space it to match. And then finally on the right, you can see I got underfloor heating. So there are some aluminium spreader plates with plastic pipe. So my partner really wanted wood floor. You know, we had a debate. Anyway, it ended up being wood floor on top. That is a natural insulator. So from a underfloor heating perspective, it's not optimal. And I ended up deciding to put a small peaking radiator for the coldest days, just in case. Really think about and agree as a kind of family unit what floor you want beforehand. If you're happy with a sort of more ceramic floor, underfloor heating 100%, even if it's spreader plates between joists, because there's no thermal mass here. So I don't have a screed to sort of gently heat up and get to temperature and then release heat through. It's got to deliver heat, and it's going to struggle. So I look forward to the winter to see how it manages. My hope is that it will still gently heat the room. Our calculations suggest it will, and that only on the very coldest days that we need to put the radiator on in that room. But yeah, floor choice, ideally we'd have had ceramic. With the air tightness tests, it meant that we identified that the bifold doors at the back and the casement windows in our dormer bedroom there was just air just gushing out. So that again was a difficult but necessary investment decision. So that was much more air tightness and not really about glazing, sort of being at double or triple. So yeah, that was quite the bifold was a real investment. So that was FSC certified, triple glazed, argon filled. Yeah, that was quite a sting. Casement windows more affordable. Ventilation. So this was another. We've decided we're going to go for it, and we're going to go airtight, as airtight as we can get it. So that means we need to think about ventilation, because if we're stopping air getting in, well, what are we going to do with moisture? What are we going to do? We still need to sort of breathe. So we need to have some form of mechanism of changing our air. So we looked and decided, and we really ummed and ahed over this, but we decided let's go for the mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. It's a big investment. It's about the same price as a heat pump. So we paid just shy of £10,000. So a very substantial investment. But I think it was the right decision. It manages our moisture incredibly well. So we have 2 kids, we're always washing. And in the last place, I had black mold everywhere. It was actually getting scary. And so we're constantly bleaching. It was just a nightmare. Whereas now, you know, it's just managing our moisture. The moisture content of the air is completely managed by the system. It's got a condensate pipe that effectively discharges whatever it's not able to reject out of the vents at the top. It's fantastic. It really is. And from an energy efficiency perspective, it's unreal. It's the operating cost of a fridge. It's about 25 watts. I did the calcs and had them confirmed actually by a heat engineer that on a cold day, the air change, we're doing at 40 litres a second. It would be the equivalent heating of about 600 watts of energy just to heat that air coming in up. Whereas we are effectively retaining that heat, losing about 1 degree Celsius on the extract to supply, and yet it's only 25 watts. You know, that's just, if you just imagine the number of hours over winter where that's just gently ticking over. I mean, yeah, I'm looking forward to sort of really working out just how much that's saving. But it just looking at that difference in wattage should tell us a lot. It had its challenges. I mean, I did find the MHR a bit tricky. So they didn't really explain exactly how the condensate pipe worked and so on. And there was a lot of sort of, oh, you need to do this, and not really explaining exactly what this meant. So I had a lot of fun doing that. So I ended up putting the condensate pipe in and getting it all working. Had to get it into the loft, so they couldn't get it in the loft. Our builders, like, no, they wanted an obscene amount of money to get it in. So I ended up installing a temporary hoist. This was one of my proud moments of the thing, because I then one-handed got it into the loft using a hoist. And avoided all these large costs. So you might sometimes have to think a bit outside of the box if you're doing some of these things, and putting big kit into a loft space. As you can see, it only just about fits. You need to think about your ducting. So I definitely do this first if you're going to do it, because I think they're 75 mil pipes. I wanted them insulated as well, just in case we ever do a kind of cooling. So it was, that's taking up a lot of space. So you've got to really think through how that's going to work. So they did their CAD drawings, and then reality on the ground was we did something very different, because they can do their best on CAD, but it's only when you're on site with the guy that you're actually going to figure it out. Air tightness was another area. So I did all the air tightness. So that's, making sure when you're putting, so I was about to build a sort of subfloor here for our washing machine. Well, make sure it's all taped up nicely so that when you then put something on top of it, when you then sort of maybe do a kind of mastic type finish around edges, that actually beneath you've made it really airtight as well. So it's sort of, you've done it. So again, on all the stud work, where there are obvious points of possible air infiltration through underfloor, making sure that's done. Using membranes across kind of steel. That's what's holding the flue up, the chimney stack. Again, really sort of taking the time to sort of just put a membrane where and then I've sealed that off afterwards. It's quite simple stuff, but it's quite impactful. So before I had my second air tightness test, and we halved the air infiltration, and that's before I finished boxing out ducts, so that I still knew there were sort of quite big gaps, but I already halved it just by doing these measures. So I hope to get down to about 3 changes per hour at 50 pascals. And I think I did some Wikipediaing, because it's quite hard to get to. Obviously, the house is never at 50 pascals, it's atmospheric pressure. But I think the rule of thumb that I was Googling the other day is you divide by 20 to get to your rough atmospheric changes. So that's already going to be a pretty good. If I get 3 divided by 20, that if it's even 3 divided by 10, that's still pretty decent in terms of heat loss calculations. From an energy perspective, you can see in the loft, that's where the MVHR unit with the insulated ducts going into a manifold that then leads to the radial ducts that go to all of the vents in the house. This is our 8 kilowatts heat pump, and I put a kind of slatted finish on it to sort of, it was a provision of the planning permission. But personally, I like the look of a heat pump. I want people to know we've got a heat pump and that this is the future. But anyway, planners saw it differently. But anyway, so that's the kind of finish. Key there is obviously you don't want to over restrict the airflow into the unit. Otherwise, you've just undermined the whole purpose of the heat pump. So it's got no top, very little on the back and sides, and it's really just sort of more visual. We went a bit kind of luxury and did a battery. That's just because I love sort of energy and sort of understanding how it all works. This is I would say, a nice to have. It's definitely not a must, as with the PV here, which we put in. Different people have different views. For me, it's all about the heat pump, and we also put in solar thermal for our hot water. So from about April all the way through to September, we get all our showers, hot water, baths, and so on just from this. It's amazing stuff. It just holds the tank at about 55 degrees, and it works really well. I've been so impressed actually by the solar thermal. And this is just a picture just showing the underfloor manifold. I also properly nerded out and developed a home monitoring system. So coded it and even designed the circuit board and all the instrumentation to manage, to monitor rather, our home energy, simply because you'll get like the heat pump. So Samsung might have its app. Tesla's got its app and it's pretty whizzy, the Tesla app. Resol will have their solar thermal app. But who wants to just keep flicking across apps? I kind of wanted a one-stop shop, and I also wanted to have a sort of underlying database that gathered all the data, because that I always had access to, and it was mine and it was there, rather than saying download it. So I developed this in collaboration with our heat installers. They've got their system. So T4 Sustainability, they have an OBEMS energy monitoring system that they do with a Raspberry Pi. I wanted a graphical user interface so I can look at it on my phone rather than just go to a desktop. So I developed in Python the sort of GUI and the instrumentation, and then used their software, which they publish on GitHub, to do effectively the pulse metering like server. So effectively every time there's a watt hour registered in our electricity submeters for the heat pump, for the solar pump, for the what else? There's other ones. A PV, of course, and the battery. Then effectively the server in C++ takes note, and then my software then talks to the server and says, "Hey, how many pulses have you had since I last talked to you?" And then it will update the calcs accordingly. So that was quite a fun journey, shall we say. I knew nothing about electronics and just read Electronics for Dummies and ended up designing this circuit board, which miraculously works. I think you can just see it in the bottom right here in earnest, and also here. And then the finish. So I ended up building my own kitchen to try and that actually is what allowed me to pay for the MVHR. So big savings if you can build your own kitchen. I was amazed at how expensive kitchens are, but by building it myself, it cost me about £3,000. So that was quite a substantial saving, and it's beautiful. It's FSC certified, birch ply, low volatile organic compounds, just what I want for my kitchen. So I was quite pleased with that. I've put a few lessons learned, but I've said most of them through, and I'm sure I've talked way too long, so sorry. I think now I will pass. I'm passing on to, is it Phil? Yeah.
Many thanks, George. Brilliant stuff. There's lots of detail in there. Are you happy for your presentation to be circulated afterwards? And
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All the links to people you've mentioned and stuff like that. That'd be
yes.
great. Brilliant. Okay, doke. I'll romp through mine. It's I think George has given a really good kind of flavour for what's involved in getting your hands very, very mucky with the whole process. And we got ours slightly less mucky, but I'll take you through the kind of highlights of it. So if I just quickly share screen with you. hopefully that has now appeared. And can someone give me a thumbs up so that's visible? There's a thumb. Excellent. We've got 2 thumbs, so this is even better. So, apart from that, I can't actually move it. There we go. Right. So, this is my and Caroline's house, which the story of it is that I designed a passive house for a couple, which you can see in the image on the left on Hobmore Terrace, which they moved into about 4 years back. And after they'd been there about 6 months, they noticed the house next door, which is the rather ratty looking Victorian end terraced house you can see in the right hand photo that just come on the market. So we took a look at it, we did some very quick sums and rather scarily bought it by a process of modern auction, which basically means you phone somebody up, offer them some money, and then suddenly find you owe somebody £230,000. So fairly terrifying business. Anyway, an elderly lady had lived there previously, so it had nothing done to it for years. It's in a shameful state, and it's just the kind of place that us architects love to find. So just running through what it was like at the time, this kind of flags up kind of good buildings, a good building to do stuff to, and it's very much contrast with George's lovely house, where, as he said, when I kind of walked into it and saw what he was planning on doing to it, I nearly had a heart attack, but ours was very much up for it. It had, yep.
Sorry, is it possible to make it bigger? Can you put it full screen? Because we can see it, but it is quite small, and I don't know if someone
Okay, I will have a go. Is that better? Better? Good. Okay. Right. So the house had some structural issues. It had been underpinned as it was falling off the end of the terrace, and subsequently ended up with pile foundations going in, a concrete ground floor, and the house standing on that concrete ground floor. So one of the first things I did was to try and make sure that there was some insulation in the ground floor. So we punched a hole through the external wall to check. And this is what we found, which is that there was, albeit not lots, but there was some insulation in that ground floor. Hold on a moment. The brickwork to the front and back of the house was in fairly reasonable condition, and we quite like the idea of keeping it that way. The flank wall had already been rendered, and so therefore was not going to be something we necessarily wanted to keep exposed. But the flank wall did face due south, which is something we thought might have advantages as we went forward. The windows were horrible, but the openings that they'd been stuck into were still in reasonably good condition. The house had gas central heating with an old boiler, and you can just see the flue coming out of the bedroom wall there where the boiler lived in a cupboard. The roof had not been converted. It was a standard loft with a loft hatch into it, but the roof was in reasonable condition. The house, importantly, had land to the side of it. The plot was a reasonable size, and so there was room to extend the house at ground floor level if we wanted to, which was something we were considering. And it looked out on the back onto woodland, which was managed by a local trust, which was a lovely thing to look out onto. The things that we wanted to do to it in order to provide what we wanted was to extend across the site with a living space at the back, as you can see in the foreground of this image here, and an office for myself to the front of the site. A courtyard in between the two where we could, I would have a short walk to work, about 6 feet, and our bikes would have somewhere to live. I designed it so that we could put green roofs onto the 2 extensions just to try and keep it, to return to the people who lived over the road some of the green that we were taking away by building on the land to the side of the house. We ripped out the staircase, which you virtually needed climbing gear to get up, and put in a shallower staircase and altered the planning of the ground floor to allow that, and we installed a ground floor toilet underneath it. We reconfigured the very nasty bathroom upstairs, which this image shows, and a very small bedroom to turn into a couple of rooms for utility come laundry come toilet, and a bathroom and shower room. And the steps along the way that were key. First thing, as George has mentioned, we set up an energy model using PHPP, which is the Passive House Planning Package software, and used this as a way of seeing what kind of things we could do to the building and what kind of impact they would have. So what we ended up with was, so in trying to get the heating demand of the house down, improving the energy efficiency by improving the fabric of the building, we used a mix of external wall insulation on the gable wall, which was, I say, in a mess already, which we were going to do things on the outside of, and internal wall insulation to the front and back of the house to keep the brickwork on the outside. We increased the loft insulation because that's an easy thing to do. And we left the ground floor of the existing part of the building well alone because, as I said, the whole house was standing on that. We ripped out the nasty aluminium windows and replaced them with triple glazed sash lookalike windows. Actually, a sash, it's a tilt and turn bottom pane and a fixed upper pane, which looked very convincing, very much kind of took the house back to looking more like a Victorian house, but gave us really good performance. And we got a new insulated front door from the same company, which matched the neighbour's door almost perfectly. We used the whole process of doing the improvements to the fabric to improve the air tightness of the house. So when we were insulating, when we were replacing windows, when we were doing things to doors, at the same time, we were making sure that we were sealing up leakage and improving the air tightness to get the house to the kind of point where mechanical ventilation with heat recovery is worth putting in, and that you're shifting around a known amount of air rather than half of that air disappearing off through leaks in the house. And I think George has already said a bit about the kind of benefits of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery in terms of the energy savings. So what I did as part of this setting up the energy model was to try and find out what the peak load was. What's the worst case? How much heat does a house need in the middle of winter when it's 0 degrees or less outside? You want to keep it at 20 odd inside. And set up the energy systems of the house to provide for that. So what we ended up doing was putting solar photovoltaics onto the gable wall of the house and onto the roof of the back addition. So we had a mixture of vertical and sloping panels, all of them facing absolutely dead south. Installed, like George, we are the Tesla Installation Appreciation Society, who installed a battery in order to do two things. One was to make use of that solar photovoltaic capacity. So rather than exporting when we weren't using it, we were able to dump it into the battery and make use of it later. And also the ability to use cheap electricity or to buy cheap electricity and then use it during the day. The graph you see here on the left-hand side, there's a 4 hours nighttime charging up there, where the grey above the line is the grid electricity coming into the house and going straight into the battery, which is the green block underneath the line, meaning that we're buying it at very cheap rates and are able to then use it during the course of the day to get us through the expensive electric period. So just some reflections on that process. First is that the moving house provided opportunity. And as George said, even with a house which has got nice finishes inside, it feels much less painful trashing stuff when you're not living in the house and when you haven't got used to it being yours than it does when you've done it and it's a kind of ripping off stuff that you've done to the house previously yourself. So it was kind of a really good opportunity to buy somewhere that drastically needed doing things to it and using that as an opportunity to create something which worked in the future. We bought the property with the extension and the alterations to it very much in mind. The house as it was would not have worked for us. There just wasn't enough space downstairs for us to live in, but there was plenty of space upstairs for us to sleep in. So we bought with a view to the future, which basically means that going around houses with a mental image not of what is there, but of what you want to be there. I appreciate as an architect, I've kind of got a bit of a head start in this, and it's my job, but it's something to really bear in mind when looking around. The next point really was the freedom to focus on what was important to us. So for us, it's very much we wanted nice living space. We wanted space that related well to the outdoors and to the landscape. I wanted this short walk to work, and we didn't want too many spare bedrooms because the last thing we wanted is members of our extended family deciding to come and stay with us for ages. So simply having 2 bedrooms was absolutely brilliant. One thing which I did, which I'd always recommend, is I involved the builder very early in this process. Again, being an architect, I've got a slight head start in having worked with different builders. I know ones I can trust, but I would suggest for anybody finding a builder who you trust through a process of talking to people, talking to builders clients, past and present, getting to the point where you found somebody who you know is not going to screw you, and who you know that their advice you can take and rely upon, and get them involved early. So that Steve, the builder who worked with us, pretty much as soon as we'd thought about offering money on the house, Steve did 2 sides of A4, which was a kind of rough budget. And that turned into a spreadsheet, and that turned into a detailed cost model, and it turned into invoices as the job went on. But there was a process through that, which at a very early stage, the builder who finally did the job was able to work with me on pricing the whole thing. The last point on here is we'd moved from a listed building on Holgate Road, which was, lovely though it was in many ways an utter pain, and there was absolutely nothing we could do to it without having to apply for listed building consent, which is not good. And the chances of getting the kind of things that we would want to do to it, for example, the house on Holgate Road, at one point I applied for, I contacted the planners to talk about the idea of putting solar panels on the front face of the roof. The planner basically laughed. What he did eventually suggest was putting solar panels on the north face of the roof, which I decided was, while it's fabulous in terms of the appearance of the building, was not going to do an awful lot in the way of generating electricity. So finding houses, the idea of being in a conservation area or listed building is lovely from the point of view of the heritage, but from the point of view of creating a house for a sustainable future can be extremely problematic. So that was a consideration, and that indeed is my last slide. So I will stop screen sharing. So yes, let's move on to Ivana, because I think one of the things that's come through this process from both of us is that it's kind of handy having someone around who can point you at the right people to do the right things. So I think this is probably where you come in. You'll need to unmute yourself there.
Yeah, I did click on it, but sometimes it just doesn't work. Yeah, so are we doing questions afterwards then? I guess I will try and be brief, so maybe, yeah, okay. I've just posted a link, actually, an article that I came across a while ago, which is about how to choose a house. Maybe if you're kind of starting with the I want to retrofit mind rather than what sort of house you want, then maybe some tips on how to choose one that will be a bit easier to possibly retrofit than others, which I thought was quite helpful. So the thing to think about. So I'll burble on a bit while I'm looking for my slides. So just to kind of put a bit of context, I guess, so I'm a sustainability officer at St. Nick's, and in my spare time, I am one of the directors of York Community Energy, so 2 local charities, each doing slightly different things. St. Nick's is mostly about green spaces, but also encouraging people to adopt a more sustainable lifestyle through providing curbside recycling scheme, low carbon recycling scheme, and lots of other projects. We also do ecotherapy, whilst Your Community Energy is very much focused on sort of climate issues and in relation to energy, trying to set up a solar co-op, so trying to get solar on schools, but also looking at homes, because around a third of York's carbon emissions comes from the way we heat and power homes. So what do we do about that? So we sort of got together, the 2 charities, and applied for some funding just to sort of get something started in the city. And this project is for people who are in a vulnerable situation. So it's a 2-year project, but we very much hope that it will carry on afterwards. It's funded by the Energy Redress Scheme, and it provides free support on energy issues to York residents who are either on a low income or aged 65 plus or experiencing a long-term health condition. So that's quite specific, and it's basically providing sort of free support on energy issues, advice. We also can install some small energy efficiency measures, from LED light bulbs to draft proofing, which is ordered some chimney sheep. And we can refer to other organizations for further help, for grants, so for hugs and things like that. But we also can offer only a small number of whole house assessments. And this is really what I want to talk to you about, because whole house assessments, I think, are sorry, I forgot about my transitions there. We work with lots of local partners, with Yorkshire Energy Doctor, who sort of helps us provide training for frontline support organisations, and we work with lots of other local organisations. But the whole house approach, I think both George and Phil have already covered a lot of it, what it means. That basically you sort of try and look at the house as a system, which is complete with its occupants. So you need to make sure that the occupants are happy with what you're doing, which quite a lot of insulation schemes in the past certainly were not doing. So the occupant is very much part of the picture. And then it's the whole idea of, making insulation as thorough as possible, making sure that it's all airtight, that you're sorting out moisture issues. It's a balancing act, because the more you insulate, the more you also then need to ventilate and make sure that you keep fresh air coming in and that you're removing the moisture. So the idea is that a whole house assessment can help you work out a plan of how to basically get the house from what it is now and look at it and what it could be in the future, and how you can phase the works in an order that sort of makes sense, and that hopefully prevents you doing something now that then later on you will have to undo. So it's based on the sort of fabric first principle. So that means fixing up the fabric of the house. So that's your walls, floors, windows, doors, that sort of thing, trying to get the fabric of the house as good as possible, starting actually with some repairs. So making sure that if you already have some moisture issues in the house, again, you fix them up before you start retrofitting. So that's the sort of fabric house first. Then you sort of try and make the building services more efficient. And then ideally you would be looking at low carbon renewable energy systems and how you provide the energy that you need once you've reduced the energy demand through all those initial works, how you then provide the energy that you do need. So with your community energy, so this is your community energy project now, and that's working with Retrofit Plus Architecture, Maria, who's in the picture on the right, who is a qualified retrofit coordinator, and I think in her final year of architect, which I had no idea quite how long it takes to become an architect. She's nearly there. So she specializes in retrofit, so it's very much her sort of expertise. So we can offer now, actually in conjunction with Maria, we can offer full whole house assessment. So that means it's a fairly in-depth sort of survey. So we go in, we measure the house and sort of look at any existing issues. And then Maria models the house. So she tends to use the PHPP software, which Phil and George have both mentioned, because you get the best results and you get fancy graphs. If graphs are your thing, then this is definitely one for you. And doing all that, so we sort of ask for drawings, any sort of, we do look at the EPCs as well, even though that, they are not necessarily that good at giving you a good picture of what the house is like, but we sort of try and collate as much information as we can about the house and talk to the homeowners and find out what their ambitions are, what are their priorities, what is it that you want to change about the house. Is it that you mostly want to sort of cut carbon and make the house as energy efficient as possible, or is the comfort what is actually the most important aspect, what the budget is? So we have quite a detailed chat as well, and then Maria puts it all together and comes up with 3 scenarios. So going from stage 1, which is basically sort of fixing up issues, sort of some small, I guess if you like, shallow retrofit measures, then a sort of a middle stage, all the way to a radical retrofit, what that would entail. And from this graph you can see, so this is one of the reports that she has produced for a local home. You can see what sort of modeled, I guess, energy use you get. So on the left hand side, what the house is like now, all the way to the 3rd stage, where actually the house could be generating some energy through solar panels and sort of bringing that into the mix. And it is a paid service because there's actually quite a lot of time that goes into this, but apparently you can spend maybe £1,000 just on getting architectural drawings of a house. So we believe that the £400 to £700 figure on something that hopefully will help you come up with a good plan that you can then follow is actually a sound investment in the house. So it's definitely aimed at people who are planning some medium to major upgrades to the house. Possibly not not something you would invest in if you were planning just some small works. So another service that we're sort of developing is actually what we've decided to call a home energy checkup. So using the whole house approach, but not going all the way through the modeling and sort of getting quite as detailed. We won't come up with detailed scenarios, but just looking at a home, sort of using the sort of whole house lens. We can offer sort of simpler surveys, and that's sort of really for those who are looking to sort of save energy with some smaller upgrades, and that costs somewhere around £100 mark. And sort of the ambition that we have is to become a one-stop shop for energy-related advice one day. So for now, we're kind of focusing on two somewhat different, I guess, clientele, if you like. But we, eventually we want to become a one-stop shop for anyone, regardless of how much money they have or what sort of tenure they have, so that anyone can come to us and ask for advice. What we would love to develop and sort of are hoping to, and certainly with people like Phil and George who have been through the process, we are sort of trying to find local companies that can actually do this work, because one thing is producing a fancy report that tells you what to do, but then people ask, okay, so who do I go to actually get the work done? And it's proving really difficult to be finding, to be able to recommend local contractors. So it's fantastic to know who George can recommend, or I also know who not to recommend, maybe. So we're hoping to build basically a database of local contractors that we can sort of pass people on to. We very much want to be feeding into and being part of the city's retrofit strategy, which is now being drafted, and we hope that the council will actually get sort of more people involved and sort of to try and make sure that basically those 2/3 of your homes that at the moment are not well insulated, so that the vast majority of houses in York do get insulated, and everyone can benefit from all those amazing things that Phil and George have, and comfortable houses. That's what everyone wants, and I think everyone has a right to live in a healthy, comfy home. It might, and I'm not talking about fancy gadgets, Tesla batteries, yeah, great, but actually just a house that is healthy, isn't moldy. I think that is something that everyone should have a right to. So that's the ambition, and I guess in terms of what the future brings, I would very much recommend that maybe you go and see. If you haven't booked your tour on your Copenhagen Homes, which is happening this Saturday, which is an opportunity to actually go see Phil's and George's house, plus Lyle and Mike, who have done slightly different things in different places, slightly different houses. So if you haven't booked your ticket, I would very much recommend that you do book a tour. It's free. And I think Saturday is supposed to be an okay day as well. So otherwise, so go in and explore and get inspired. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ivana. That was great. So some contrasting stuff on the two projects we talked through, some useful stuff on what help can be given. Have we got any questions? Any questions? If so, please just pop your camera on or pop a virtual hand up or whatever else, and let's have them. It's all gone quiet. Yeah, go for it, Ivana.
Add while people are warming up, I'm sure someone will come think of a question. Just to also add that your community energy can actually lend out over the winter period. We can lend out a thermal imaging camera. So if you want to see what your home is like, how much heat it's leaking, then we can help you look at that.
Yeah, can I speak as a major fan of thermal imaging itself? It's basically like suddenly developing X-ray vision and being able to see into the structure, because you can immediately find out what horrors are going on in there, and it's absolutely brilliant fun. So yes, I do recommend getting hold of the thermal imaging camera and a bit of quick instruction about what you should be looking for on it. So they're good bits of kit.
And it's also a good way to check up on it, whether work has been done well. Someone has borrowed it off us who had their attic redone, and the camera was revealing how badly that was done.
Yep, they very much tell the truth. We have no questions, apparently.
I have a
Oh,
question.
we do. Andrew, go for it.
Yeah. One of the things about the sort of the air tightness thing, how does that fit with things like sash windows, and which are sort of, I guess, tricky? Is the only option to sort of seal them up, or can they be genuinely sort of draft proof sufficiently?
I think I'll chip in first. I know George's got something he wants to add to it as well. But I think the thing with air tightness is basically going as far as you can. One of the issues about air tightness has two problems about it. One is obviously leakage of heat into the outside world that you'd rather keep in. The other is that it tends to be points at which wet, moist air from your house is getting carried into the building structure. So to some extent, a bit of air leakage through the sashes of a sash window is not a problem on that second count. It's merely a bit of warm air getting away that you would otherwise rather didn't get away. So it's not as problematic as some of the other issues that you'll get with air leakage, where you've got air leakage into brickwork through where joist ends go into, or stuff like that. So to some extent, it's less problematic. So anything you can do in terms of improving the performance of sash windows, there are one or two specialist companies. There's certainly a company in Yorkshire that do nothing other than refurbish sash windows. So we had them do our sash windows on our last house, which while if we weren't trying to get anything like kind of serious levels of air tightness, but the difference in terms of being able to be in the room and not feel cold air kind of wafting across your chest was just magic. So you can go quite a long way. I think the issue is how far do you want to go with them? If you do want to really kind of start doing serious stuff, then you do end up looking at either replacing sashes or replacing the whole units. But certainly getting them as draft proofs as possible would make a worthwhile improvement. So yeah, anything from Ivana or George on sash windows?
Yeah, I mean, getting an air tightness test, it costs about £150. You can really identify which of your sash windows are actually seriously leaky, and because actually, as long as it's sort of they're engaging well around the frame hasn't warped, and actually it's creating a closure, you're not going to get a huge amount of air just sort of at atmospheric pressure moving through those gaps. It's when you get it's closing and it's not actually engaging properly, and there's actual cracks where you could actually look through and see that air's not only light coming through, obviously air's coming through. So when we had our casement windows, for example, I think Phil, when you went upstairs, you had to there was so much pressure difference that you almost had to force the door open because it was closed, and then you could see why, because there was just a giant gaping, even though it was closed, there was just a huge gap nonetheless. Whereas I've retained all of the sash windows, barring those casement windows up at the top, and they're not 100%. That's part of the reason why we get 3.5 changes. But still, it's not sort of 11 changes at 50 pascals. It's that's pretty manageable actually, and it's also you can if it's I would say that test is key, and then if you do identify ones where the wood has affected, the timber has effectively warped, then that becomes a decision. I probably need to replace, or at least start budgeting to replace.
Yeah, just to add to what George said, if you've got a roll of tape handy when they do the air tightness test, you can quickly tape up one of your sash windows and see what difference it makes. If it makes bugger all difference, then you don't need to worry about it. And in fact, there are other places that you do need to worry about more. So
yeah.
Okay, we've got a question turned up in the chat box from Jenny about cavity wall insulation. Ivana, is this anything you'd want to pick up on without bowling you too difficult one?
Well, I feel like you might be more qualified. I haven't quite finished my retrofit course yet, but but I think cavity wall certainly is a tricky one. I think for the potential benefits, that you may get from having that fairly small amount of insulation sort of put in through retrofitting. I think the risks of bringing damp into the house are rather high, so that's why we generally would not recommend it. I think whenever possible, go internal or external. I think the what to do now, that I might pass over back to Phil, because it will depend a bit on whether, is it because of the insulation, or are there some other issues going on? You might need to kind of look at what exactly is happening in their home, I would have thought, but maybe Phil, you might have better ideas on that.
Yeah, tricky one. I mean, I'm not a building surveyor, I have to say. However, I think I'd agree with Ivana that generally these days, if you're looking at improving building fabric insulation, you'd look at either internal or external insulation, because you're only going to get 50 mil of insulation generally within a cavity anyway, and then there is the risk of bridging. As Ivana said, it could be a number of things. So it could be about the fact that because of other things you've done to the house, there's reduced air movement of ventilation, and therefore you're getting more moisture in the air internally. It could be about the fact that the cavity insulation is starting to bring moisture across from the outer leaf onto the inner leaf. If that's the case, then the drastic solution to that is getting in there and removing insulation from those areas. You don't say how long ago it was done. What I would check what warranty there is. If you have a route to get the contractor who did the cavity wall insulation back in. If they are no longer around, as many are not, then if there's a route to an industry body that would enable you to get someone in to check on it. Beyond that, I'm not sure, but I will try and make some kind of online inquiries, and if there's anything useful I find, I'll make sure that goes out in the email we circulate after this event. But yeah, cavities are there for a reason. Beyond simply providing a little bit of insulation, they are very much there to try and keep the wet outer leaf away from the nice dry inner leaf. But it's rather late in the day to
One
tell
thing
you that.
though is interesting, if it's just forming around the windows, particularly, it could be that if you imagine at the edge of a wall and then the start of your timber frame of the window, it could be that actually it's a bit of a cold spot, and so effectively moisture is condensing on there. So what we did with our installation was we tried actually to overlap effectively the timber with the insulation, so that you would not have a point where your insulation stops and sort of the timber starts immediately. So I wonder whether the cavity, obviously I'm not as trained as Ivana and Phil, but it strikes me that with a cavity wall insulation, I would have thought that would be a natural risk area, just literally around the windows, just irrespective, because there's no insulation actually at that point, so it will be a natural cold spot. And it's whether, I don't know whether like little measures, like just a small bit of insulation around the window frame to try and reduce that cold spot. I don't know, but there must be forums that sort of explore this. If ventilation can't be improved, i.e. something like we've got, like mechanical ventilation. But I'm probably speaking out of turn.
No, I think you're right. I mean, as you say, the brickwork, the reveals of the windows are always going to be a cooler area anyway, partly because of that link between the window frame and the brickwork on the or blockwork on the inside, and partly also just because you've got a window there, so the area around it's going to be a bit cooler. I guess the issue with whether it's down to just those kind of factors comes down to, if it wasn't there before the cavity was insulated, then you kind of think it probably isn't just down to that cold bridging through from the window frame, but not entirely sure. It's not a very straightforward one, but I'll see if I can find any help to point you at. Any other questions?
Of course, it could also be that the insulation is it's not evenly spread, so it might just be that there's basically bits missing, and it is around the windows. That's something that potentially a thermal imaging camera might help reveal. It's sort of, ours is not the sort of top range quality one, so it might not necessarily do, but possibly in winter it might be worth having a look at that.
you do get perverse things happening, like once you've got insulation in the walls and the whole house gets a little bit warmer inside, the air then gets a little bit moister inside, which means that you're more likely to get. So yes, any kind of investigation would be a good starting point. Okay, doke. If there are no further questions, we are running up towards 9 o'clock, and I know there are people here who still haven't had their tea here. Oh, hold on. Building surveyor here. Oh, interesting tip. John Skelton says, building surveyor here, if it has black spots, it's condensation forming on a cold surface. If it's yellow, it's probably penetrating damp. So the colour of your spots. Black is condensation on a cold surface, yellow is penetrating damp. I guess the issue, if it is cold surface, is why it's cold in the first place. But as George said, there's possibly one reason for that. As Ivana said, there's possibly another reason for that. So I think probably think about some initial investigation with a thermal imaging camera and then take it from there. Right, I think we're just about done. So what I'm going to do now is to stop the recording.